In the closing years of the 19th century, in a small Austrian town called Braunau am Inn, nestled on the border between Austria and Bavaria, a child was born who would one day plunge the entire world into its most devastating conflict. Adolf Hitler entered the world on the 20th of April, 1889, the fourth child of Adolf Hitler, a strict and domineering customs official, and Clara Hitler, a gentle and deeply devoted mother who adored her son with a tenderness that bordered on obsession. From the very beginning, the household was defined by sharp contrasts. Adolf was a cold and authoritarian father, a self-made man who had clawed his way up from illegitimate poverty to a respectable government post and expected his children to follow orderly, practical paths. Young Adolf, however, was dreamy, stubborn, and filled with grandiose ideas about himself. Father and son clashed constantly. Adolf wanted his boy to follow him into the civil service. Adolf wanted to be an artist. These arguments were never truly resolved because Adolf died suddenly of a lung hemorrhage in January 1903 when Adolf was just 13 years old. With the disciplinarian gone, young Adolf drifted, spending his days drawing, reading, and fantasizing about greatness while his school performance collapsed so completely that he never received his final school certificate. Clara Hitler, a quiet and selfless woman who had already lost 3 children in infancy before Adolf was born, poured everything she had into her surviving son. She indulged his artistic ambitions, managed the modest pension left by Adolf, and created a home in which Adolf was never seriously challenged to confront his own limitations. When Clara was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1907, the 18-year-old Adolf nursed her through her final weeks with genuine devotion. Her death on the 21st of December, 1907, left him, by his own later account, utterly shattered. A Jewish doctor who had treated her, Eduard Bloch, later recalled that in all his years of practice, he had never seen a young man so prostrated by grief. Hitler thanked Bloch personally and gave him one of his own paintings as a token of gratitude, one of the most profound ironies in the entire history of the 20th century, given what Hitler would one day do to the Jewish people of Europe. With his mother gone and his small inheritance dwindling, Hitler packed his things and moved to Vienna in 1907 with burning ambitions of becoming a great painter. He applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts and was rejected. He applied again the following year and was rejected a second time. The admissions board found his figure drawing technically inadequate and suggested, not unkindly, that he might have more aptitude for architecture, for a young man of enormous ego and fragile inner life. This double rejection was crushing. Rather than accept the verdict of qualified judges, seek formal training, or reconsider his path, Hitler retreated into resentment. He told almost no one, not even his closest companion at the time, a young man named August Kubizek, that he had been rejected. He continued pretending for a time that he was a student at the academy, wandering the grand boulevards of Vienna while his money ran out. Vienna in the early years of the 20th century was one of the most remarkable cities on earth, the glittering capital of the Habsburg Empire, a place of concert halls and coffee houses, of Freud and Klimt and Mahler, of grand imperial architecture and cosmopolitan intellectual life. But beneath its gleaming surface, Vienna was also a city seething with political tension, ethnic rivalry, and ideological conflict. The empire it governed contained a dozen different nationalities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, Slovenes, and many others, all jostling against one another in an increasingly unstable political arrangement. And across this landscape ran a thick vein of anti-Semitism, some of it centuries old and rooted in religious prejudice, some of it newer and dressed in the pseudoscientific language of race theory and social Darwinism. Pamphlets blaming Jews for Germany's and Austria's problems were sold openly on street corners. Politicians built careers on anti-Jewish rhetoric. The mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger, was a charismatic demagogue who had mastered the art of blaming Jewish bankers and businessmen for the economic anxieties of the city's lower middle classes, and the crowds loved him for it. Hitler, living in genuine poverty by 1909, sleeping in parks during summer and a men's hostel during winter, selling small watercolor paintings to tourists and interior decorators, absorbed all of this. He read voraciously but undiscriminatingly, consuming nationalist newspapers, racial pamphlets, and occult magazines with the same uncritical appetite, taking from everything only what confirmed the ideas already crystallizing in his mind. He was not, by serious intellectual standards, a thinker. He was a reader who never read anything that challenged him, a debater who never debated anyone who could match him, a man who mistook the volume of his convictions for the depth of his understanding. But in Vienna's poisoned ideological atmosphere, he absorbed enough to construct a worldview crude, rigid, and vicious that would barely change for the rest of his life. The world was a struggle between races. The Aryan race, of which Germans were the supreme expression, was locked in a mortal battle for survival against inferior races, and above all against the Jews, whom Hitler came to see not merely as an inferior people, but as a deliberate and conspiring force of corruption. working to undermine Aryan civilization from within. It was a fantasy, paranoid, hallucinatory, and utterly without foundation in reality, but it was the fantasy around which Adolf Hitler organized his entire existence. In May 1913, Hitler left Vienna for Munich, the capital of Bavaria and a city he had long romanticized as more authentically German than the multi-ethnic Habsburg capital. He was 24 years old, still stateless, still penniless, still painting postcards. When the First World War erupted in August 1914 and Germany mobilized for conflict, Hitler greeted the news with pure and unconcealed joy. He was photographed in the ecstatic crowd in Munich's Odeonsplatz, his narrow face alight with something close to rapture. He enlisted immediately in the Bavarian army, technically as an Austrian citizen, though the paperwork was overlooked in the chaos of mobilization, and was posted to the Western Front as a dispatch runner, carrying messages between the regimental headquarters and the forward trenches through the constant bombardment of artillery. It was genuinely dangerous work. Hitler proved himself brave and dependable in the role, and was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class in 1914, and more remarkably, the Iron Cross First Class in 1918, a decoration rarely given to enlisted men and usually reserved for officers. He wore it until the day he died. The trenches gave Hitler something he had never truly possessed before, a sense of purpose, of structure, of belonging. The army fed him, clothed him, told him where to be and what to do, and rewarded him for the qualities he actually had rather than the artistic genius he only imagined. He found genuine comradeship with the men around him, and unlike most of his fellow soldiers, he seemed to actively enjoy the experience of war. He did not drink, did not gamble, did not frequent prostitutes, or complain about conditions the way most soldiers did. He sketched ruins and read newspapers, and maintained an air of peculiar solemnity that his fellow soldiers found slightly odd. Some found him insufferably preaky, but he was respected as a reliable and brave soldier. When Germany collapsed in November 1918 and the armistice was signed, Hitler was in a military hospital in Pacewalk, recovering from a British mustard gas attack that had temporarily robbed him of his sight. He was lying in his hospital bed, bandages over his eyes, when a pastor arrived to inform the ward that Germany had surrendered and the Kaiser had abdicated. Hitler later claimed that at that moment, everything went dark again, that he staggered back to his bed and buried his burning face in his pillow. He wrote that he wept for the first time since his mother's death. And he claimed that it was in that hospital bed nationalist in that darkness, Hitler, that he made his decision, and occult politics. Germany that Hitler returned to after the war was a country in profound and multidimensional trauma. The physical destruction of the war was immense: 2 million German soldiers dead, 4 million wounded, a generation of young men gone or broken. The economic disruption was severe, the political landscape was chaotic, and the psychological wound was perhaps the deepest of all. Germany had not been invaded. Its armies had been fighting on foreign soil until the very end. The surrender had come not after enemy troops crossed the Rhine, but after political collapse at home. As revolution swept through German cities, sailors mutinied and the Kaiser fled. To ordinary Germans, and above all to the officers and soldiers who had served, this was incomprehensible. How could an army that had never been defeated in the field come home to find its country surrendering? The answer that the nationalist and military right offered was simple, satisfying, and completely false. Germany had been stabbed in the back. The army had been betrayed by traitors at home, socialists, pacifists, and Jews, who had undermined the war effort from within and handed victory to the enemy at the moment it was within Germany's grasp. This legend, the Dalchstus legend, was a lie invented to protect the reputations of the generals who had actually lost the war and to redirect German anger away from those responsible. But it was an extraordinarily effective lie, because it gave millions of people an explanation for an experience they could not otherwise process, and it gave them an enemy to hate. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, transformed wounded national pride into burning humiliation. Under its terms, Germany lost 13% of its territory, including the industrial Rhineland and the largely German-speaking region of Alsace-Lorraine. Its army was reduced to 100,000 men, a fraction of what it had been. Its navy was scuttled. It was forbidden an air force. It was required. Destruction of the war was immense article, clause causing the war, and to pay political reparations to the Allied landscape was chaotic powers on that basis. Gold its marks, the astronomical surrender figure had that come not after Germany could not enemy troops cross the possibly pay Rhine, but that after economists on Political all collapse at sides home, recognized as economically absurd. Governments were two sailors constrained by domestic mutinied politics to say so publicly. To Germans across the ordinary political spectrum, national and above all to the catastrophe, who had served Hitler and the nationalist right, it was confirmation of everything they already incomprehensible believed, that defeated in the field come Germany had been home to find its betrayed, the enemies were implacable, could save the nation. In September 1919, the intelligence army had been agent for the betrayed by military and party, gathered in the back who had room of a Munich beer hall to discuss the undermined the war woes. Enemy at the he went moment, it was within German eyes innocent intent to report on them for the army. He sat in the back, Dolch des Legend listened. Lie and at one point was invented to drawn into and protect the argument with the reputations of the speaker, who had advocated for generals who had Bavaria to actually lost the break war, away to from Germany and join redirect Austria. Hitler responded with such force, extraordinarily such effective, lie rapid-fire conviction, gave and millions of such people in withering explanation for and contempt for the idea that the room experienced they could not fell silent and otherwise process stared. Anton Drexler, founder's colleague and whispered, "My, he's got a gob." Booklet on Hitler as he Germany lost left. Later described reading it on the tram home and deciding Rhineland, and the after a largely struggle that German lasted 2 days to join. It was reduced he to a 100,000 later met, step of his a life, 555. Within weeks, Hitler had become the party's most effective speaker and its greatest asset. He possessed, as if by some terrible gift, an extraordinary natural talent for public oratory, a talent so raw and powerful that even those who despised his ideas were often shaken by the experience of hearing him speak. His voice could modulate from conversational intimacy to thundering denunciation within a single sentence. His body moved with theatrical energy, arms sweeping wide, fists clenching and unclenching, eyes fixing individual members of the audience with an intensity that made them feel personally addressed. He had a genius for identifying an audience's emotions, their fear, their shame, their anger, their hunger for pride, and for giving those emotions language and direction. He spoke not in policy proposals or rational argument, but in images and feelings. In the language of apocalypse and salvation, Germany was dying. Germany had been betrayed. Germany could be reborn, but only through struggle, only through sacrifice, only through the will to identify and destroy the enemies in their midst. When Hitler finished speaking, men who had arrived skeptical often left converted. Women wept, men stood and shouted. Collections taken after his speeches regularly produced more money than all the party's other fundraising combined. By 1920, Hitler had reshaped the German Workers' Party into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, which the press quickly shortened to the Nazi Party. He had designed or approved its visual identity with the instinct of a propagandist, the hooked cross, the swastika, rendered in black on a white circle on a blood-red background, a design of maximum visual aggression. He had pushed through a 25-point program that blended nationalist demands, anti-Semitic provisions, and vague promises of social welfare, in a combination deliberately designed to appeal to as many constituencies as possible. He had begun building around himself a circle of devoted followers, men who would become the inner leadership of the Nazi movement. Hermann Goering, the dashing and decorated fighter ace who had commanded the legendary Richthofen squadron, brought glamour and social respectability. Ernst Röhr, the scarred and brutal army officer, built and led the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the brown-shirted stormtroopers who provided muscle at rallies and menace on the streets. Rudolf Hess, the devoted and slightly mystical former soldier, became Hitler's personal secretary and worshipper. And in 1922, a young man named Joseph Goebbels attended a Hitler speech and left transformed, a fanatic convert who would devote his formidable intelligence entirely to the cause of making Adolf Hitler the ruler of Germany. In November 1923, intoxicated by the success of Mussolini's march on Rome the previous year, and convinced that Germany's crisis had reached the point where a bold stroke could topple the government, Hitler launched his own attempt at revolution. On the night of the 8th of November, he and several hundred armed followers stormed a crowded beer hall in Munich, where Bavarian state officials were holding a meeting. Waving a pistol over his head, Hitler fired a shot into the ceiling and declared that the national revolution had begun. It was the most dramatic moment of his career so far, and it was a complete disaster. The planned coordination with sympathetic military and police units fell apart. The Bavarian government recovered its nerve overnight. The following morning, when Hitler and his column of 3,000 marchers set off through Munich's streets toward the War Ministry, they were met by a police cordon in the narrow Residenzstrasse. Shots were fired. Who fired first has never been definitively established. Within seconds, 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were dead. Goering was shot in the thigh. Hitler threw himself to the ground, dislocating his shoulder. The column broke and fled. Hitler was captured 2 days later, hiding in the country house of a supporter. The trial that followed in February 1924 should have ended Hitler's political career. He was charged with treason, an offense that for a foreigner could mean deportation. Instead, it became the making of him as a national figure. The sympathetic judges allowed Hitler to turn the courtroom into a stage, and he performed brilliantly. For hours he lectured, denounced, and prophesied, attacking the government that had signed the armistice. Politicians who had accepted Versailles, the Jews and Marxists, he blamed for Germany's degradation, while the gallery applauded and the press filled its front pages. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, but the sentence made clear he would serve a fraction of it. In Landsberg, Hitler lived in comfortable rooms, received a constant stream of admiring visitors who brought flowers and food, held court among a devoted circle of fellow prisoners, and dictated the first volume of Mein Kampf, My Struggle, to Rudolf Hess. The book was rambling, verbose, and frequently unreadable, but it laid out with total clarity the ideology that would drive the Nazi regime. The supremacy of the Aryan race, the existential menace of the Jews, the need for Lebensraum, living space, in the East, and the necessity of a single, all-powerful leader to forge the German nation into an instrument of conquest and survival. He was released in December 1924 after serving just over 8 months. The Germany Hitler returned to was, inconveniently, recovering. The Dawes Plan had restructured the reparations payments. American loans were flowing into German industry. Inflation had been brought under control, and the street violence of the early Weimar years was subsiding. Chancellor Gustav Stresemann had stabilized the Republic and was pursuing a cautious diplomatic rehabilitation of Germany's international standing. In the elections of 1928, the Nazi Party won just 12 seats in the Reichstag, less than 3% of the vote. Most political observers regarded Hitler as a figure of the recent turbulent past rather than the future. But Hitler used these years of adversity wisely. He reorganized the party from the ground up, creating a sophisticated network of regional offices, GA, each headed by a loyal Gauleiter, knitting the movement into a genuinely national organization rather than a Munich phenomenon. He cultivated wealthy patrons, industrialists, bankers, and aristocrats who found his movement crude but potentially useful as a bulwark against communist revolution. He developed the party's propaganda operation, brought Goebbels to Berlin as the capital's party chief, and refined the mass rally as an art form, an overwhelming sensory experience of flags, music, lighting, choreographed crowds, and Hitler's own mesmerizing oratory, designed to produce in participants a feeling of being part of something vast, inevitable, and sacred. And then in October 1929, the world changed again. The Wall Street crash sent shockwaves through the entire global economy, but Germany, with its dependence on American loans and its already fragile financial system, was hit with particular devastation. Within 2 years, unemployment had soared from under 1 million to over 6 million, roughly 30% of the workforce. Millions more were on reduced hours or had given up looking for work entirely. Factories closed, banks collapsed. Families who had survived the hyperinflation of 1923 watched their modest rebuilt savings vanish overnight. The middle classes, teachers, shopkeepers, craftsmen, minor civil servants, the precise people who formed the backbone of German society and who had barely recovered from the previous disaster, found themselves facing ruin a second time within a decade. The young found no jobs waiting for them. The old found their pensions worthless. Republic the not won an offense that just offense that government. Instead, it became the observers macking of him as responded with paralysis. The collapsed in the March sympathetic 1930 over Simpa. Wisely, brilliantly bypassing he parliament, descended into chaos, denounced, fistfights, and on the floor, in the government that had Gauss signed the corridors. Democratic politicians who had governance and knitting the accepted movement into a grinding toward Versailles' breakdown. He desperate, gallery Germans, applauded, and the press message was filled it's clear, democracy did not work. Into this catastrophe, the Nazi Party poured its resources with focused, relentless energy. Goebbels had built a propaganda machine of extraordinary effectiveness. Nazi speakers fanned out across Germany, into every town, every village, every factory, every farmer's market, with a message carefully tailored to each audience. To farmers facing foreclosure, they promised protection. To the unemployed, they promised jobs and the dignity of work. To small businessmen crushed by department stores and banks, they promised relief from the Jewish financiers they blamed for the crisis. To young men with no prospects, they offered purpose, excitement, and the electric sense of belonging to a movement on the march. To women, they presented Hitler as a man of simple living and pure devotion to Germany, a political monk who had sacrificed personal happiness for the nation. To conservatives and nationalists, they promised the crushing of communism and the restoration of Germany's greatness. To everyone, they offered the seductive simplicity of a worldview that had one answer to every question. Germany's problems had one cause: the Jews, the Marxists, the betrayers. Remove them, and Germany would be reborn. The electoral results were staggering. In the September 1930 elections, the Nazi Party leapt from 12 seats to 107, the second largest party in the Reichstag overnight. In July 1932, at the peak of their electoral support, they won 230 seats and 37% of the vote, the largest share any single party had ever won in a German national election. Hitler was now a figure of global significance. Foreign journalists arrived in Germany to try to understand what was happening. Some dismissed him, others were disturbed by him. Almost none understood the full implications of what they were watching. Hitler himself ran for president against Hindenburg in 1932, losing but winning 36% of the vote, a remarkable result for a man who had not even been a German citizen until the previous year. The Nazi Party had become the most powerful political force in Germany without yet holding power, and the question of what to do about it was tearing the country's conservative establishment apart. The men who ultimately handed Hitler power were not his followers but his enemies, or rather, the men who believed they were his superiors. President Hindenburg, the 85-year-old field marshal who had commanded Germany's armies in the war and who now presided over a crumbling republic, had a personal contempt for Hitler that was social as much as political. He called him that Bohemian corporal, refused to shake his hand at their first meeting, and took every opportunity to signal his disdain for the upstart Austrian. But Hindenburg was surrounded by advisors who had convinced themselves they were cleverer than they were. Franz von Papen, the sleek and ambitious conservative politician who served briefly as chancellor in 1932, was the principal architect of the scheme that destroyed Germany. Papen believed he could form a coalition government with Hitler as chancellor, but with conservatives filling all the key cabinet positions: war, finance, foreign affairs, interior, effectively using Hitler as a popular figurehead, while the real decisions were made by men of breeding and experience. Hitler, Papen assured Hindenburg, would be contained. "We've hired him," Papen reportedly boasted to a colleague. "Within 2 months we'll have pushed Hitler into a corner so hard that he'll squeak." It is difficult, at this distance, to fully comprehend the scale of this miscalculation. Papen and those who thought like him had watched Hitler for years and had still failed to understand him. They saw the crowds and dismissed them as the hysterical masses. They heard the speeches and filtered out the genocidal threats as political rhetoric, as the kind of exaggerated language all demagogues used to rouse their followers. They looked at Hitler himself, the awkward social manner, the slightly ridiculous Charlie Chaplin mustache, the ill-fitting suits, the embarrassing enthusiasm, and saw a man who would be easy to manage, a puppet who could be used and discarded. They were not stupid men in the ordinary sense, but they were blinded by class arrogance, by the comfortable assumption that real power belonged to people like themselves. On the 30th of January, 1933, Paul von Hindenburg summoned Adolf Hitler to the presidential palace in Berlin, and in a brief and chilly ceremony, appointed him Chancellor of the German Reich. In the streets that night, columns of SA and SS men marched by torchlight through the Brandenburg Gate, their boots striking the cobblestones in rhythmic thunder, their torches casting long shadows on the faces of the watching crowds. Joseph Goebbels, watching from a window, wept with joy. The old field marshal, watching from his own window, turned away in distaste. He could not know that within 18 months he would be dead, his office would be abolished, and the man he had hired would be the absolute master of Germany. The transformation of Germany from a republic into a totalitarian dictatorship took less than 2 years. And much of it happened with the appearance of legality, a cynical exploitation of the very democratic procedures that the Nazis had always despised. The Reichstag fire on the 27th of February, 1933, whether the work of the lone Dutch communist who was convicted for it, or a Nazi provocation, or some combination, was the first great crisis that Hitler turned to his advantage. Within hours, he had persuaded the already frightened Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, suspending the fundamental rights guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, the right to privacy of correspondence, protection from arbitrary arrest. Overnight, the legal framework for police state was in place. The SA and the newly empowered SS began rounding up communists, socialists, trade union leaders, and anyone else on their lists. The concentration camp at Dachau, the first of many, opened its gates in March 1933. Less than a month after the fire, on the 23rd of March, 1933, the new Reichstag met in the Kroll Opera House. The parliament building itself had been badly damaged in the fire, to vote on the Enabling Act, which would give Hitler's government the power to pass laws without parliamentary approval for 4 years. The chamber was surrounded by SA stormtroopers. Communist deputies had already been arrested. Socialist deputies debated whether to attend at all, knowing that their votes could not prevent passage, but wondering whether absenting themselves would simply make things easier for the Nazis. In the end, the Social Democrats came, and their leader Otto Wels gave a speech of extraordinary courage, affirming his party's commitment to humanity, justice, and freedom in a room full of men who would have cheerfully murdered him, receiving a torrent of Nazi abuse in return. When the votes were counted, only the Social Democrats had voted no. Every other party, the Conservatives, the Catholics, the Nationalists, voted yes. The Enabling Act passed. Adolf Hitler was now, in practice, the dictator of Germany. The Weimar Republic had voted itself out of existence. What followed was a systematic dismantling of every institution capable of resistance. Trade unions were abolished on the 2nd of May, 1933, their offices stormed, their funds seized, their leaders arrested. In their place, a single Nazi organization, the German Labor Front, was created, which had all the appearance of a union and none of its functions. Political parties were banned one by one through the summer of 1933, until in July the Nazi Party was declared the only legal political party in Germany. The press was brought under the control of Goebbels' new Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, a title whose Orwellian transparency was entirely lost on those who chose it. Newspapers that could not be trusted were shut down or taken over. Editors who published unapproved content were arrested. The civil service was purged of Jews and political opponents under the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, another title of magnificent cynicism. Universities dismissed their Jewish faculty and their politically unreliable staff. And students who had once studied under some of the finest minds in Europe burned their books in bonfires while crowds cheered. And they replaced Lee extraordinary rewritten, absorbed into the SS-affirming apparatus, Gleichschaltung, freedom in a room full of men who coordination, receiving and the order. And yet, and this is the part of the story most uncomfortable to tell of the German population, not only accepted all of this but genuinely welcomed it. The economy was improving. Hitler had launched massive public works programs, roads, buildings, public spaces that were putting men back to work. Unemployment, which had stood at over 6 million in 1932, fell dramatically through the mid-1930s, though the true reasons were complex and involved military rearmament as much as public works. The streets did feel safer, partly because the SA had been brought under tighter control after the Night of the Long Knives in June 1934, when Hitler had Röhm and the SA leadership murdered to reassure the army and the conservative establishment, and partly because the political violence that had convulsed the Weimar years had simply been redirected into the apparatus of state terror, which ordinary middle-class Germans did not have to witness. Germany was rearming, rebuilding its military power, and challenging the humiliations of Versailles. In 1936, German troops reoccupied the Rhineland, which the treaty had demilitarized, and the Western powers did nothing. Germans felt strong again. They felt proud again. The shame of 1918 was being washed away. And if the cost of this, the persecution of the Jews, the disappearance of political opponents into camps, the extinction of press freedom and individual rights, if the cost of this troubled people, there was always the comfort of not looking too closely, of telling oneself it was being exaggerated, of believing that surely things would not go so far. On the 2nd of August, 1934, President Hindenburg died. Within hours, Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor into a new single title, Führer und Reichskanzler, Leader and Reich Chancellor. The same day, every soldier in the German armed forces swore a personal oath of loyalty, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, but to Adolf Hitler himself. The army, which had been the one institution powerful enough to challenge Nazi rule, had bound itself to the man it had sought to use. The consolidation was complete. The man who had been born in a border town in Austria 45 years earlier, who had failed art school twice, who had slept in homeless shelters and sold postcards on the streets of Vienna, who had risen to corporal in the war and spent 8 months in prison for a failed putsch. That man was now the absolute master of Germany, the commander of one of the most powerful military and industrial machines on earth, and he was already planning what to do with it. Before we ask how it ended, we must understand how deeply the Nazi system had embedded itself into the fabric of everyday German life by the mid-1930s. Because the consolidation of Hitler's power was not merely political or military. It was cultural, psychological, and social in ways that made resistance not just dangerous, but genuinely difficult for ordinary people to even conceptualize. The Hitler Youth, the Hitlerjugend, enrolled boys from the age of 10, filling their evenings and weekends with marching, camping, physical training, and ideological instruction that celebrated strength, obedience, racial pride, and loyalty to the Führer above all else, including family. The League of German Girls did the same for young women, training them in domestic skills and the ideology of racial motherhood. By the late 1930s, membership was effectively compulsory. An entire generation of German young people was being raised inside a totalitarian value system from childhood, trained to see the world through Nazi eyes before they were old enough to have developed any other framework for understanding it. Parents who tried to counteract this influence at home risked denunciation by their own children, who had been taught that loyalty to Hitler superseded loyalty to parents. The men it had welcomed it sought to Gestapo use Staatspolizei, man who had been the secret born in a massive state police system of totalitarian art perfection, were months in actually prison for a failed putsch relatively unemployment, stood officers at for over the 6th country of million in commander of one of the 6 nice 7 powerful million people. What to do with surveillance alone. and what it relied on. Must to a rearmament as understand how a significant and deep lie the Nazi public system had shameful works embedded degree, had been ordinary brought under because the tighter Germans, political or neighbors, the informed on army and the family social in ways that made members. People political dangerous but violence that had reported Jews who had not worn their genuine lie, convulsed the yellow difficult for Weimar years had stars. Office. They reported women who had been seen speaking to foreign workers. Some did it out of genuine ideological conviction. Some did it out of personal grievance, a long-running feud with a neighbor, a business rivalry, a romantic jealousy, given a new and lethal form by the machinery of state terror. And some did it, perhaps most disturbing of all, simply because the system made it easy and rewarded it and offered no cost for doing so. Ordinary human petness, given a totalitarian infrastructure, becomes an instrument of mass murder. The persecution of Germany's Jewish community, approximately 500,000 people, less than 1% of the population, escalated in a series of stages whose logic, in retrospect, seems horribly clear, though at each step there were those who believed it could go no further. The boycott of Jewish businesses in April 1933 was the first organized act of state-sponsored anti-Semitic persecution. Then came the Nuremberg Laws of September 1935, which stripped German Jews of their citizenship, prohibited marriage or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, and defined Jewishness in racial terms, a definition so broad that people who had never considered themselves Jewish, whose grandparents had converted to Christianity, found themselves classified as Jews under Nazi law. Then came Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, on the 9th and 10th of November 1938, when SA and SS units, supposedly acting spontaneously but in fact coordinated by Goebbels, attacked Jewish businesses, homes, and synagogues across Germany and Austria. 7,000 businesses were destroyed. Over 1,000 synagogues were burned. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. 91 people were killed in the pogrom itself, though many more died in the camps in its aftermath. The broken glass of Jewish shop windows lay across the streets of German cities for days, and the world watched. Some expressed outrage. Most did nothing that mattered, and the German government imposed a fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks on the Jewish community, punishing the victims for the destruction done to them. It is important, in telling this story, not to reduce the German population to a monolith of either complicity or victimhood. There were Germans who resisted, who helped Jewish neighbors hide, who smuggled people across borders, who printed underground newspapers and distributed leaflets at enormous personal risk. The members of the White Rose, Hans and Sophie Scholl, and their small circle of Munich University students, produced and distributed anti-Nazi pamphlets from 1942 until their arrest, trial, and execution in 1943. The conspirators of the July 20th plot, who came within a fraction of an inch of killing Hitler with a bomb in his own headquarters in 1944, included senior military officers, aristocrats, and civil servants who had served the regime before turning against it. Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian, chose to return to Germany from the safety of America to bear witness and resist, was arrested in 1943, and was hanged in Flossenburg concentration camp just 3 weeks before the war ended. These people existed and they deserve to be remembered, but they were exceptions, and their exceptionalism is itself part of the historical record, because the fact that resistance was possible makes the absence of it, among so many millions, all the more significant. How do we understand what had happened? How does a democracy, however imperfect, however embattled, surrender itself to a single man? The answers are not simple, and they are not comfortable, because they do not allow us to locate the problem entirely in the abnormality of Adolf Hitler. Hitler was abnormal, certainly, a man of pathological hatreds, volcanic ambition, and a will to power that operated beyond the normal constraints of empathy or conscience. All neighbor, in given a telling this extraordinary new meaning, entirely helped Jewish twice, with an offered hide a decade no cost for doing so, given a printed totalitarian savings and security of underground millions of infrastructure ordinary people newsers, and had done nothing wrong becomes leaflets and an NT of mass enormous instrument of murder. New, rooted, to see it approximately small fail. Percent of the afraid of the left than of the right. Despised, in retrospect, conspirators of the July 20th desperate lie plot, Hungary seems for horribly clear order and pride. Jewish businesses in Political April 1933 was the first promises, per human face, would say make everything 1900. One man driven by grievance so profound it had become a worldview, by ambition so total it had become a vocation, and by a talent for reading and manipulating human emotion so extraordinary it amounted almost to a dark genius, who understood, with visceral and terrible clarity, exactly how to convert the suffering of millions into political power. Adolf Hitler did not rise to power because Germans were uniquely evil or uniquely foolish. He rose to power because the conditions were right, and because he was exactly the kind of man those conditions called forth. The story of his rise is not a story about one country in one particular moment of history. It is a story about what happens to any society when its institutions are weak, its people are desperate, and someone clever enough arrives to tell them exactly what they most need and most fear to hear. That is why, almost a century later, we have not stopped studying it, and that is why we must never stop. Directly to the if you could make worlds certain we ourselves thoughts inhabit. The language role for of them had been language, the role of contaminated words. Camps, Nazis long before he banned launched books not wars, destruction of but because they European feared the jury, linguistic universe words that named in which all of these things became injustice thinkable. Not as people that with different described the beliefs or humanity of the different cultural persecuted backgrounds, but as a plague, a resistance pestilence. These were genuinely dangerous to a regime, that dangerous to a regime that depended on the population's inability to articulate what was being done. Vermin, parasites, organisms whose nature was to infect and destroy healthy bodies. He described his political opponents not as people with different views, but as traitors, criminals, enemies of the people. He described Germany's difficulties not as the complex results of historical forces, but as the deliberate work of identifiable enemies who were conspiring against the German people. This language mattered enormously, when human beings are described consistently, over years and decades. In the language of infection and infestation rather than the language of humanity, it becomes possible to contemplate doing to them things that would otherwise be unthinkable. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, who observed the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi bureaucrat who had organized the transportation of Jews to the death camps, described his crime not as demonic evil, but as a terrifying absence of thought. He had not hated the people he sent to their deaths, at least not in any conventional sense. He had simply ceased to think of them as people at all. The language had done that work for him, long before the trains began to roll. Goebbels understood this with total clarity, and it was one of the reasons he was, in his own despicable way, a genius. He grasped that controlling the language people used to describe their reality was the most fundamental form of political control. If you could determine what words people reached for when they thought about Jews, about communists, about their own national identity, about the state of their country, if you could make certain thoughts literally unspeakable because the language for them had been removed or contaminated, then you had won a battle deeper than any military campaign. The Nazis banned books not merely because they feared the ideas in them, but because they feared the language. Words that named injustice clearly, that described the humanity of the persecuted, that offered a vocabulary of resistance. These were genuinely dangerous to a regime that depended on the population's inability to articulate what was being done to them and in their name. This is why the study of Hitler's rise is not merely a historical exercise, not merely the forensic examination of a distant disaster. It is a lesson in how language shapes perception, how fear can be weaponized, how the slow erosion of norms can make the previously unimaginable seem ordinary. The process by which Germany moved from Weimar democracy to Nazi dictatorship was not instantaneous. It was gradual, proceeded through increments that each seemed, taken alone, survivable. One more decree, one more restriction, one more category of persons stripped of rights. The historian Robert Gelately has described this as the boiling frog quality of totalitarian consolidation, the temperature rising so slowly that those in the water do not realize they are being cooked until it is too late to leap out. Each step normalized the next. Each outrage made the following outrage easier to accept, because by then the framework within which people were making their moral judgments had already been deformed. We should be precise about what Hitler was and what he was not, because both the demonization and the trivialization of him carry their own dangers. He was not a supernatural figure, not a demon, not a unique aberration so far outside the range of human experience that no comparison is ever valid or instructive. He was a human being, formed by specific historical circumstances, possessed of specific talents and specific pathologies, operating in a specific political context. Understanding him means understanding those circumstances, those talents, those pathologies, that context, not in order to excuse him, but in order to learn from the conditions that made him possible. Insist on not merely treating the forensic Hitler as a exam. Uncomfortable it is a recognition that the lesson in how conditions that language produced him, economic despair, democratic how the failure, norms can make the previous lie manipulation of legitimate unimaginable grievance, scapegoating of the process by which minorities. Weimar, the seduction of democracy to Nazi simple dictatorship, was not answers to instantaneous complex problems. 1930s. Proceeded through their potential increments that each seemed conditions of any society under sufficient pressure. And that recognition, survivable, uncomfortable, one unwelcome, but restriction necessary, is person the most important stripped of rights. Less on this story has to teach us. History does not Robert repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes, boiling as the frog saying goes. The specific horror of Nazi Germany, with its particular ideology, its particular victims, its particular geography and moment, will not recur in precisely that form. But the mechanisms by which it arose, the erosion of institutional trust, the cultivation of an enemy, the promise of national greatness as compensation for personal insecurity, the capture of the media, the marginalization of truth, these are mechanisms that operate wherever the conditions are ripe. The study of how Hitler rose to power is therefore not the study of a closed chapter. It is the study of an open warning, and every generation, in every country that values its freedom, has the obligation to read it.